nice to meet you, and thank you for agreeing to speak to me. I just would want to introduce you first of all, so that people who are listening, if they don't already know you, so just let me know if this is the correct introduction. But I've taken it from your book, Unlearning Shame, that you're a Dr. Devon Price, social psychologist, professor, author, and proud autistic person. Your research has appeared in journals like the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, Personality and Social Psychology. You live in Chicago, where you serve as an assistant professor at Loyola University, which is University of Chicago's School of Continuing and Professional Studies. And I'm Alexandra Stevens. So thank you for coming along and appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Alexandra.
Mm-hmm. So I contacted you because I'm in the process of attempting to write in a book called You Don't Have to Abandon Yourself to Belong. And it's really looking at the ways we abandon ourselves in order to belong. But I'm looking at it more from a sort of attachment-focused lens, and also the ways that attachment trauma can be transmitted through families. I mean, particularly, I'm interested in this because of my own experiences with how I've that shows up for me in my life. And so I was interested in speaking to you because I think that you sort of look at it from a slightly wider social lens.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought it'd be useful to get your perspective as well, and to see what I could learn from you. So that's why I contacted you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so interconnected, right? Like the attachment systems that get activated. Like I think a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about in books like Unlearning Shame about, the external whys that push people to do it might be these big societal forces, but how it feels in our bodies is a lot of times our attachment system is going absolutely haywire. And that's like the mechanism that a lot of the stuff that I write about happens is through like an internal one. It's a lot of that stuff that you're talking about, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I want to move on to that. But before that, I thought, well, first of all, I just wanted to just say my experience of reading the book. So, I mean, admittedly, I've read about half of it. I haven't managed to read it all. But, I mean, I just felt quite liberated just reading about it, and uplifted, and as if there was a bit more space, because it kind of made me think, okay. I mean, then maybe I don't have to, if there's also a systemic shame that is influencing and contributing to my personal feelings, perhaps of imposter syndrome or undeservingness, or the self-sacrifice pattern that I've identified in myself, then in a way that's like, okay, well, that's something that I can conceptualize, therefore that's something I can shift. And you talk about ways you can shift it in your book. So for me, I found it, as I said, quite liberating to read your what you say about systemic shame. And I also particularly appreciated the way you wrote, your willingness to be open and vulnerable and share your own story. And as I say out loud, I imagine that's also partly what you said about it. It's important to speak our shame, or speak from our shame, as a way to kind of to make it less big. So I just wanted to appreciate you doing that as well, because it helped me.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. I think it's such an important exercise in the ideas behind the book to actually reveal the stuff that is, and for me, I'm somebody who I feel like it's for me to share a lot about myself relative to other people in the world who they might not have the job security, or they have some really real kind of external and material reasons in addition to the shame that might kind of keep them holding back. And I just thought, if I have the freedom to do this, and I feel comfortable doing this stuff as somebody who is both like a researcher and a writer and kind of a storyteller, this stuff is where I live. And it's so much easier, I think, to unlearn it when you're doing it alongside someone who's working on it at the same time. So,
yeah. I also wanted to just name part of like an ashamed part that's coming up now around perhaps not reading all the book, or a part that feels that it's a bit kind of in awe of your academic qualifications. But I'm naming that just to put it to one side. I'm not naming it because I need it to be taken care of or to be, in a different way. But that's just, sometimes I find that just naming something helps me to just kind of move past it.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the candor, because it's this thing that like ends up being a wedge in a lot of my relationships, where from my perspective, like the things that I've done, I don't really feel any like pride in them, or like they make me anything different from anyone else. But people find a PhD intimidating. They find if somebody's had a certain kind of success that like gives you public notoriety, they find that intimidating, which makes sense. But yeah, I find like I'm often in this position of telling people like, no, listen, like, you saw the people I went to grad school with, if you saw some of the professors that were mentors to me, some of these people have so little insight into the world. Like, we should not be like impressed by like these like hierarchies or like authoritarian like labels that like give somebody some state of authority. Like, and go weird. I get a weird kind of shame on the opposite end, where it's almost like, oh, I'm not all that, like, please,
Yeah.
Like, I'm just some guy. So no, that is it's such a thing, and it kind of cuts both ways in an interesting way.
Yeah. And actually, as I was just thinking about this before I joined the call, I was thinking, well, actually, I could probably reframe that as well, because the story in my head is, oh, well, I failed my first degree and had to redo it. So in my head, I've got this thing going that I'm not that academic or whatever. But I was thinking about what you talk about, and I can't remember the term you use when you kind of expansive recognition, when you just look a bit wider, you say, well, as you said in your book, I think you say women, especially Black women, often have this feeling of imposter syndrome. Actually, I think there are less women academics generally in the world. So I'm thinking, well, okay, it is my personal shame, but there's also something wider going on there as well, of why I might feel like, oh, I'm not good enough to interview a doctor, or a part of me does anyway.
Right. Yeah. You've been like made to feel that by all of these societal forces, and like, and the feeling itself isn't a problem. And I think a lot of times when people feel like imposter syndrome, even as a label, puts the problem on the individual woman feeling it, instead of why have so many women been excluded from academia, or why especially have so many Black women and women of color been excluded from academia. And it's like, that's the problem. And like, I don't know, it's kind of, I think it comes back to an attachment thing too, in a way, where like a lot of times if somebody has insecure attachment in a specific relationship, that's not coming out of nowhere, right? Like a lot of times they're picking up on something actually real in that dynamic that's making them feel insecure. And so it's like, if you've been treated like an imposter all your life, of course you're going to feel like it, like if you've been treated like you don't belong, it's a very rational response.
Yeah. And I wanted to come back to the what you said about relationships a bit later on, because I found that interesting. But I thought maybe before that, it might be helpful, maybe if you could maybe just say a bit more about the book, or some of the key concepts, just so that people who are listening kind of know what we're talking about. Are you okay to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I can kind of talk about kind of the genesis for unlearning shame for me. One thing that I noticed throughout the pandemic was how easily it seemed like the public was duped into thinking the reason that the pandemic was happening was because individual people were behaving badly, rather than looking at the ways that here in the United States, this is especially true, where I'm coming from. The spread of the pandemic was so caused by institutional failures, companies bringing people into work way prematurely, no one investing systematically in better ventilation, not handing out masks, not handing out vaccines like in a really organized way. All of these systems had kind of failed. And yet I saw people all around me, like COVID conscious, kind of progressive and leftist people, viewing it as a problem caused by individuals being irresponsible and people being selfish and people being immoral. And as a queer person and somebody who studied a lot of public health and persuasion stuff, it really reminded me of the early rhetoric around the HIV crisis, where again, governments had failed to take it seriously or study HIV or invest any resources in it for years. And also we're putting all this moralistic blame onto your men and sex workers and drug users and saying that it was because they were doing these immoral things, that it was their fault that this virus was spreading. So that was one of the things that I was thinking about. And I was also noticing more generally how there were a lot of reckonings that were happening in society around 2020, 2021. And a lot of it was really important, but people would get focused on the individual aspect rather than the structural aspect. So even things like talking about institutional racism, people here in the US, there was a big movement for Black lives and protests and shutdowns and, you know, fighting against police violence. But then sometimes the attention would go on to, well, are you as an individual person doing the right things? Is this individual police officer a good or bad person, when it's a much bigger issue than that? And that was just all also set against the backdrop of my own kind of feelings of personal shame as a trans person who was kind of living publicly as somebody who looked different and was part of this like symbol of this larger group that was getting really demonized by the government. So over and over again, I saw all these ways in which there is this legal, medical, social, you know, systematic exclusion of groups of people based on things like health status, based on things like race, based on things like being queer. And we all, if we're affected by those things, how quick we are to personalize it and to feel like I'm because I'm working hard enough. And it seemed to me like this trick that like had bewitched almost all of us about everything from the environment to feeling bad about our bodies, that we feel like we are personally morally responsible. What's going on is that we've all been failed, and that actually if we saw it less and less as an individual issue and more as a collective problem, we could really work for better solutions. And so that was something I really, really was excited to write about in Unlearning Shame. And I thought we had to really talk about shame on all of those levels, both the personal and kind of the societal, and how it affects our relationships, to really work on tackling it. And that's kind of what the book is about.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for summarizing. So yeah, my sort of summary, which is what you've just said, is the sort of moving away from I am the problem to looking at that it's more about, you know, the structural inequalities, the core beliefs that there could be in society, could be from religion. You said something about when people started to own property, different, especially when they stratify societies. As a result, you know, this starts to be this shaming, and that it can be often be the individual that's shamed, as opposed to maybe I'm not the problem, but you said it's society, there's a problem with society, it's bigger than me. And then you go on to talk about things that we can do, radical self-acceptance, etc., a vulnerable connection, and joining with society as well, or doing more social community things. Yeah, as a way to, okay, great. So got an idea of what it's about. So I suppose my first question, which you've already kind of spoken to, is obviously I'm quite curious as where is the overlap between, say, personal shame? You know, I guess my understanding of shame as a therapist is well, I tend to say to my clients, it's when there's been an experience of yearning for connection, but that connection was not met, and so we were left with this sort of void, and so therefore we feel shame, you know. And that could be right from the start. Say if we had a parent, and you know, who as a young baby, but the parent was not really physically available or emotionally available, you know, we can even have like a ground experience of shame, which is just like an embodied experience of shame without even any cognition to it, of just there's something wrong with me because my caregiver is not available. You know, so that's how I tend to describe it. So yeah, I'm wondering how do you see the interaction with that and systemic shame and the overlap, and yeah, that type of question. How do we differentiate?
I think the basic architecture of shame in terms of how the body or the body mind experiences it is the same, is exactly what you're describing, of this feeling of my needs aren't being met, I am going to be, or I am socially ostracized, I'm neglected in some way. There are a lot of physiological things that happen when we are feeling ashamed of ourselves that are all about hiding and making yourself smaller. And it's always a little bit hard to track down why something happens, and like evolutionary psychology is a very flawed field because they can't really test their theories of where this stuff comes from, because we can't like go back in time and like follow human evolution, but it does seem to be that there is a self-preservation function and an energy preservation function too. If you are getting nothing but negative feedback or neglect from the people around you, that you're going to kind of just make yourself smaller so that you're not attracting any more aggression, and so that you can kind of just wait out this period of neglect and perhaps survive because you're kind of preserving your energy. And I think even arguably, you know, depression might serve a similar function too sometimes for people, that it has this like energy preservation function and social withdrawal function. But so I think that is where shame comes from, just as a basic core human emotion, that it is, as you've said, a person's attachment system being thrown into a state of self-preservation, and that it is a social emotion. And it also appears to be one of my kind of earlier phases of research was morality research. It does seem to also be this moral emotion, this idea that I have done something wrong. That's how a lot of psychologists distinguish something like shame and guilt. They say that shame is about feeling like you are wrong, and that you need to hide from other people because people will see this thing about you and reject you. So that seems to be a big component of what's going on there. And I think that emotion has, as long as humans have existed and we've been social beings, probably always existed, right? There's probably always been this feeling of, I've done something that goes against what the people around me believe is right, and I need to withdraw because of that, or I'm going to be ostracized because of that. But where it becomes more systematized is when there is a culture or an aspect of how society is organized that is really pushing people, especially certain classes of people, to feel a lot of shame. So as you talk about, as you mentioned in the book, I kind of track some of the history of uses of shame and how people have kind of theorized about shame. And we do seem to see greater use of shame as a social technique that's pushed onto people, like public shaming of people in cultures where there is more hierarchy and more of a division. So when there's a really, really strict moral hierarchy and there are sinners or witches or people who are damned, you see a society that believes that, putting a lot of shame onto those groups of people. Or if you look at a culture where there is a ton of, let's say, racial or ethnic hierarchy or a caste system with something like colorism, where typically people who are darker are seen as less valued, those people are expected to feel more shame. We even see it in hierarchies around children. The more that a culture sees children as lesser than adults, as somehow not fully formed humans, that's where we tend to see cultural messages that say children need to be shamed, they need to be beaten, they need to be told to be quiet, they need to be seen but not heard, all of these things that are kind of reinforcing you are lesser. So I think really, and this is something, the more that I think about this topic, the more it kind of comes into clarity for me, that systemic shame is basically being marginalized. It's being systemically put to the margins or put into a lesser social position in some way, and being told that feeling bad about yourself is something that you're supposed to do. And that could be because you're fat, because you're a woman, because you're darker skinned, because you're disabled, whatever the hierarchy is that's kind of oppressing you. That's a really big part of what systemic shame is. And I think the other component of it is believing that that you deserve it. When you internalize that message, that you are lesser in some way and that you actually deserve it, that's when I think systemic shame is really the thorniest. It still feels, I think, emotionally the same as being told like you're a horrible person because of a thing you did. That's inexcusable. Systemic shame just happens to be that a lot of times that horrible thing that we're being told we should be ashamed of is like our sexuality or the way our body looks or our skin color or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then in that case, what would you say is the role of therapy when you're working with someone, say, who has experienced systemic shame but has also experienced attachment trauma, and maybe the people, I mean, I think of myself, I experienced attachment trauma, but then if I look from a wider lens, I could say, well, there was also systemic shame anyway within the family system, growing up in a dual heritage house with a white mother and a black father, then being with a as my mother raised us as a single parent. So there was all that going on, but there was also her own stuff going on all into the mix, and, you know, impacting me in the ways it did. So I guess our question is what I said. What is the role of therapy or therapists?
I think one of the biggest things that shame does to really erode us is to make it hard for us to have relationships. Because we absorb, if we're ashamed, we absorb this message that there's something horrible about us, that we can't let other people see that thing about us. Maybe that we need to aspire to be something other than ourselves because we believe there's something inherently wrong with ourselves. And I think with systemic shame, it can be a whole litany of different things that we feel are wrong with us, and that the whole society around us is going to be turned against us. If they could really see who we really are and how we really behave, that they would hate us and that would be completely ostracized. And that stuff is really destructive for our relationships, right? Because then you're never vulnerable. You might be putting on a completely fake mask of who you are because you think the real you is shameful. Certainly there's a lot of respectability politics in there, right? Trying to be a virtuous queer person, trying to aspire to white supremacist beauty standards, all of these things that are about hiding and about being something other than yourself and not accepting yourself. And that makes it really, really hard to attach to others because we're not letting others in. And attachment is the very thing that we need. Right. So I think one of the things that's so important and potentially powerful about therapy is that it is a space for people to practice having a relationship with someone with there being some guardrails on it, where they can feel relatively certain that the person isn't going to abandon them and that they can say the things that they otherwise wouldn't say to people. So I think there's a really strong foundation there, potentially, if you're really ashamed of yourself in a therapeutic relationship, to practice. I'm going to disclose things about myself that feel really vulnerable and scary. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be emotionally present with someone. And I'm going to have a relationship with someone that might go on for a really long time. However many years I want to see this therapist. And it might evolve and change. And they might see me evolve and change. And I might actually slowly get better at some of that work of being in a relationship with a person. I might learn what it means to actually talk with someone about difficult things. I might experience conflict with my therapist and have to work through that, or disagreement, or just change in both of our lives, or conversations about awkward subjects. And that really gives a lot of people really important practice that a lot of people have still never had, that then they can carry over to, I think, the next stage of overcoming shame that's really important, which is forming meaningful and vulnerable relationships with other people out in the world. At least in my work, you know, I speak to a lot of autistic people, a lot of really traumatized people, and a lot of them have not had an accepting, genuine, open feeling relationship in their lives ever. And so they often need a ton of practice with it in therapy first. And then once they have some relational skills, some distress tolerance for conflict, some of these just like basic things that you don't necessarily have if you didn't have a good attachment upbringing, then they can start making friends. Then they can start building community. And then they can start feeling like, wow, there are people who care about me. There are people who I can tell the truth about myself to, who aren't just a therapist that I'm paying. Maybe there's actually something lovable about me. And they can find people who have similar experiences to themselves, people who are ashamed about similar things. And they can realize, hey, this is actually not a personal or an exclusively personal issue. What I'm dealing with is something that a lot of other women are dealing with, or a lot of other plus-sized people are dealing with. It is a common struggle that we can organize around, that we can build community around. And we should kind of go after the people that are actually responsible for making us feel this bad, instead of constantly going after ourselves and isolating. So I really see working against shame as happening in these layers of kind of first working on that personal layer, then kind of working on the relational layer where you are building relationships with others, and relationships eventually become community. And community eventually becomes potential social change, or pushing for a better world. And you kind of have to work at it layer by layer. And I think a lot of us are kind of starting from that square one of just first needing to build relationships and practice opening up to people. And I think therapy is a really, really great place for that.
Yeah, it makes sense. And obviously I agree as a therapist. But yeah, it's about, I suppose, yeah, allowing someone to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel understood, or just that there's someone interested in them, curious about them, even if they don't get it quite right, that they're willing to check, have I understood you properly, etc. Yeah, sort of giving them that experience that they didn't have necessarily from key caregivers. I suppose, I guess another question though is what can therapists miss? And I, put my hand up myself, that there could be very sort of focusing on the personal elements of the shame and maybe not addressing the wider issue. Even though as a Gestalt therapist, there's this concept of the person is always linked to the environment. So it's never a case of someone just comes in feeling shame or just anxious. It's like, what is it about your environment that's shaming? What is it about your environment that's anxiety provoking? But I know in some schools of therapy that's not necessarily spoken about so much. So I guess what would be any things that you would say to therapists that would be important to think about when working with someone who's coming with shame?
Yeah, I think every therapist, just like every person, always has some stuff they need to unlearn here. And it does depend a little bit on their therapeutic orientation and training. I think there are a lot of therapists out there who are still very conventionally minded. So they might be coming to the therapeutic relationship with a client in a way that they are evaluating whether or not the patient or the client is feeling and doing things that are normal enough, a bit of a pathology frame. I think if you're still coming from a pathology frame of thinking that there's ways that a person can be wrong, or thoughts that can be bad, or feelings that can be bad, or if you as a therapist are uncomfortable with certain aspects of your client, sexuality is just a clear example that I can come up with as a queer person. If you think that something about like how sexual your client is, or the types of sex they have, is abnormal or somehow pathologizing, then you're going to be bringing a lot of shame onto your client. That's just one example, but I've certainly heard and seen a lot of cases of therapists bringing that same kind of judgment with something like drug use, or self-harm behaviors, or eating disordered behaviors, or hoarding behaviors, just some behavior that their client has that they personally think is a little bit shameful or a little bit abnormal, and kind of float that shame onto their client. Or even just thinking that the goal of a therapeutic relationship is for your client to be a normal person with a normal life. There are some therapists who just come with that frame, and it really makes it hard for them to see and accept their client as they are, and to not recognize that maybe the best life for that person might be a really unconventional looking life, or a life that even does cross some of society's taboos, and that there isn't necessarily anything wrong with being, let's say, a really hypersexual person or whatever, or recreationally using illegal drugs. Generally speaking, the people who I've seen who are drawn to becoming therapists have often been people who are good at following rules in society. And so they might be uncomfortable with people who don't follow those rules. And so they might offload some shame to their client in that way. So that's something I always want to tell therapists to just think about, is like, what are the ways in which you're still judging yourself? What are the ways that you're still being judgmental about how someone should live? How is that kind of affecting the therapeutic relationship? And I think, the other thing that you've mentioned is completely an issue too, where some therapists are totally focused on the individual relationship and the individual client's feelings, and they're not seeing the greater social and political aspect. And I think you really have to do both, because there are some therapists who are obsessed with the political and they don't see the personal enough too. I think don't do think I think you do have to, for a lot of clients going through systemic shame, you have to be able to both say, hey, your feelings make a lot of sense when you look at how the world treats people like you, or there's a lot of things going on politically in the world here that are conspiring to make you feel ashamed of yourself. And it's really valid to feel that way. And to have just some awareness of like therapy not being able to everything. That like no matter how bulletproof you make someone emotionally, they're going to step out into a world that is still racist, that is still full of climate catastrophe, that still has these political things that's going to affect them. But you do still also have to arm your client with practical stuff that they can do, right? There's kind of a duality there where you, I think generally the best tack is to both validate that there's external stuff that we can't control, and then also still to focus on the client with, okay, what stuff can you change about your relationships, your life, your self-regulation, your relationships? Like, what can you do? And also, yeah, you're really fighting an uphill battle here. I think acknowledging both is really important and can be a challenge for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. So acknowledging and recognizing the both and the situation, that both are true, the systemic shame and the personal stuff as well. Yeah. I mean, you just said a bit what I was going to ask next, which is about relationships, because in the book you talk a lot about if we are sort of judging ourselves in some way, or being critical of ourselves, then as I understand, we're more likely to sort of judge others in a similar way, or even to project onto them stuff that, judgments that we're not necessarily aware of within ourselves, and how that obviously gets in the way of having nourishing, honest, authentic relationships, close relationships. And I was interested in that, and I was sort of being honest with myself and sort of thinking about, because I think you asked some questions about the types of people one might judge, and whether it's also a judgment against ourselves, and again, I'm embarrassed as I say this, but yeah, I was recognizing that even for me, I can have some sort of internalized racism, especially as someone who's dual heritage. So I noticed that I can sometimes have judgments that make me feel embarrassed and not good, but also trying to have some compassion for myself as to how it is that way. But I was also interested because in my book, what I'm writing about is how also there can be a lack of trust, but it's usually, but I talk about it more as like we haven't had the experience of someone showing up for us, or we've expected someone to show up for us in whatever capacity, and then they've switched. They haven't been there. To give an example of, say, a volatile parent who's blown hot and cold. So I was just curious about, how you talk about more the lack of trust can be from judging people and thus keeping them at a distance. And I wondered if you could say anything more about that.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for sharing what you just shared. And it's something that I also really relate to. As a trans person, it's a different experience, but I think there's some similarities there where I myself looking at other trans people who I felt like they were, in my case, it was like they're breaking the rules. Like they're not trying hard enough to look like their gender. And I thought I worked so hard to kind of pass. I'm not doing this as much anymore now, but for a long time, I was really trying hard to look like a man to everyone, right? And so if I a trans person who was saying they're a man, but they still look really feminine, I would feel almost resentful of them for getting away with something that I felt like I wasn't free to do. So that's just something that I'll just kind of throw out, that I think that's like such a telling emotion, that when we see somebody else and we feel resentful of them, that it often tells us something about what we're not allowing ourselves to do. And how we might be pushing ourselves too hard. This is something that I also wrote about a little bit in my book, Laziness Does Not Exist, which is kind of about productivity and laziness fears. That oftentimes if you look at someone else and you say like, they're so lazy, they're not doing enough. Like if you have some coworker who you think is really like slacking off, a lot of times that's a sign that you're doing too much and you're expecting everyone else to be doing too much. So I think that's something that mucks up a lot of our relationships, where we are holding ourselves to this really extreme standard, and we're doing that because of our shame. We're thinking, if I work this hard, if I look this way, if I carry myself this way, then people will see me as okay. Then people will ignore the fact that I'm trans or that I'm disabled or whatever it is, and I'll be accepted. And my acceptance is super conditional. And I think that, and then that can bleed into how we look at others. And I think it is a mistrust of both the self and the other, right? We don't trust ourselves to be lovable or worthy, and that we don't trust people to accept us if they saw us imperfect or just being ourselves, because a lot of these things aren't even imperfections, they're just being being ourselves, but we've been told there's some people in that. And there's this weird place that we kind of get ourselves into where we're both putting ourselves on a pedestal where we are expecting ourselves better than others, but we're doing that because we think we're worse than everyone. This strange way. It's like we have to make up for who we are by being exceptional. And there's a lot of mistrust there. And I think there's a lot of work to be done when we're doing that, both at kind of trusting ourselves to be imperfect and to not meet these ridiculous standards and rules that we put on ourselves and that society put on us. Because the rules are almost always, you need to assimilate, right? You need to fit in with the kind of supremacist culture better. And relax the standards that we're putting on others and kind of seeing, and to go back to your attachment piece, like the terrifying thing is that at least as adults, I think we do have to consciously make the choice to risk trusting someone, to give someone an opportunity to show up for us, and to really be vulnerable in that way, to say, I need help with this thing, or I'm struggling with this feeling, or to ask for a favor from someone that we want to be close to, and to actually risk that they could disappoint us and to still make that choice anyway. And it's really scary stuff if we have mostly only experienced abandonment in the past, but I think it's the only way forward.
Yeah. I mean, I really like what you said about in order to trust others, we also need to be able to trust ourselves. Because that's precisely what I'm writing about, and sort of realizing that actually I can't really talk about trusting myself unless I talk about trusting others. But then I can't really talk about trusting others unless I talk about trusting myself either. And then I'm trying to sort of think, well, what does that mean, trusting myself? So I've sort of tried to separate it out, so one thing is like trusting my thinking process, for example, or trusting my perceptions about reality, for example, and like if you've lived in a household growing up where there was craziness, but then the craziness was never spoken about, or the abuse was never spoken about, then it's easy to just not trust your perception of reality anymore, or your thoughts. But then it occurred to me, just as you were talking, that if the thoughts that we have about reality are also influenced by an unequal system and systemic shame, then that would also add to the not trusting. For example, if my thoughts are that I need to look a certain way in order to be beautiful, I need to have, white skin and non-frizzy hair, for example. I was just thinking about the connection really with trusting ourselves and others, and then also how that also links to systemic shame. Don't know if that made any sense or not.
No, and your thoughts are just like giving me more to chew on this stuff for myself from a different angle, which is really exciting. That like, if you haven't had your experiences validated of like those things that you saw and felt growing up, you weren't crazy, you weren't too sensitive, you weren't the problem, like your household shouldn't have been like that, or like somebody should have been reliable as a caregiver to you. Like validating all of that stuff is so important on a personal level. And I do think some of the systemic kind of shame that you're talking about there too, of like we get taught that our bodies are wrong, that there's something just wrong innately inside of us if we're not assimilating to this like really specific, especially like white supremacist standard of moving through the world, which is physical appearance, but it's also and people can really internalize that, especially if they don't have community who don't share that experience with them, of just like there's just something wrong with me, instead of oh no, I've been failed, I've been left behind. I think that's kind of a common thread for both of those experiences of shame, both personal and systemic, that you think, oh, there's something wrong with me, and then you can have this breakthrough of like, no, there was never anything wrong with me going on here. I had a bunch of needs that nobody was meeting, and I was kind of done wrong by in a lot of ways, or neglected in a lot of ways, and that none of this was my fault. Even if I can't let it go, I might still feel it very personally and viscerally, even though I know now intellectually it's like the culture, but knowing that it's not your fault is so massive.
Yeah, I think. And I think there's knowing and there's truly believing, and I guess that's also sort of part of speaking to others, right? Feeling that you're not alone with something, that helps to sort of truly believe that you haven't done anything wrong, for example, as opposed to just intellectually knowing it. Maybe that split between mind and, well, between head and heart or head and body.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just takes so much time, I think, to really feel it and believe it. And it is easier to look at another person and say, why does that person feel ashamed of themselves? They're beautiful, they're wonderful. Like there's nothing wrong with them. And you just, it seems like you have to say that about 1 million times about others before you can believe it about yourself.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a question about sort of intersectionality. So when we belong to various different marginalized groups, and how that can impact someone more so, say, than I mean, I know you say in your book, and I agree that everyone experiences some kind of, well, usually some kind of marginality, whether they're wealthy and or whatever color they are, or whatever so it's not that there's the marginalized and then the non-marginalized. I know it's a spectrum, but when there's lots of intersections, for example, being a transgender, but also being Black, for example, or whatever the intersection is, how does that show up? Is it like or even worse, or sort of layers of shame?
Yeah, I think it's even worse, but it's not even just in terms of like addition or multiplication.
Okay.
It's like, it's you're held to an even narrower and more punishing set of standards. It's almost like a Venn diagram that has a bunch of different sections overlapping, where there's just this tiny area that you're allowed to exist in. So one thing that and it's kind of an impossible standard. I can think of a recent example that I got from the author Sabrina Strings. She wrote the book Fearing the Black Body. We were at an eating disorder conference together, and she was talking about her experiences as a Black woman with an eating disorder, Black woman in the US. And she was talking about how navigating body image for her was impossible, because in kind of the Black community where she grew up, you were expected to be curvy and somewhat thicker, and people would feel insecure about their bodies. Women would feel insecure about their bodies if they weren't that. But then she would go to school, or she would go out to a predominantly white space where everyone was worshiping thinness and having a kind of thin, especially kind of Eurocentric body type. That was really important. And so when she was in those spaces, she kind of aspired to that. And so as a Black woman, she was kind of experiencing this combination of impossible standards, where there was the really extreme body standards put onto women generally, just this idea that women's bodies are something that people always have the right to comment on. And she was having European standards or white American standards of what a body is supposed to look like, and kind of Black feminine standards of what a body is supposed to look like. So it was this misogyny and this racism and these sets of standards that are impossible to all meet at once. And so she felt ashamed everywhere that she felt, that she didn't belong anywhere. And I think that's a really common experience for a lot of intersections, especially with race. As a queer person, when I talk to Black queer people, they often have that feeling of, nowhere that I go do I belong. I can go to LGBTQ spaces, and they're going to be often predominantly white or non-Black, and I'm not going to fit in there based on race. And then I can go to more culturally Black spaces, and a lot of them are not accepting of queer people, and so I don't belong there. And so there's this feeling of, no matter where I go, there's something wrong with me. No matter where I go, there's some standard I'm not meeting. I'm trying to be all of these things at once. And I think that's part of how systemic shame really, really harms people with lots of intersecting marginalizations, where you are expected to be a certain type of person based on each one of these identities. And when you add all of those identities up, there's nothing coherent there, because society basically wants you to not exist. The way womanhood is defined in white cultures is very white centered. And so it's almost impossible to meet that standard as a Black woman. And that's because fine, right? It's this feeling, a lot of people, of erasure, of who they are just not being allowed to even exist, of who they are just being completely incoherent, and just feeling really ashamed and really invisible and lost in every part of you that kind of doesn't meet those standards. And I think, again, the more identities you have that are marginalized, I think the more constraining it seems to feel for people.
Yeah. I mean, as you were talking, I just noticed I had literally had a visceral reaction of just feeling really kind of tense and like constricted, because I could just, imagine what you said, almost like there's no space for you anywhere, almost. Yeah, and just how unbearable that must feel.
Yeah, that lack of belonging and acceptance is really tough.
Yeah, I was also curious about when two people are talking, for example, you and I, and we both have, we could say that we're both sort of minorities in a way, or marginalized in a way, but we're different, right? So that there's a similarity, there's a commonality, right? That we both might experience more layers of systemic shame, or perhaps not more layers, but more ways that we don't fit in. I'm a solo mother by choice, so I'm living a sort of like unconventional life like that with just my 2 kids and me, and obviously dual heritage as well. So I just wondered if you could speak to that, because my experience as a therapist and working with groups, it's important to name that there is commonality, but there's also a difference, and to be curious about the difference, as opposed and also aware of, just because there is that commonality, that in a way, just because there is that shame around, that can also sometimes get in the way of contact, a relationship. And so just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are really afraid of talking about it when they're quality, but also some difference. I see a lot of people being really afraid of saying something offensive. And that can be, which is a real thing that happens, but it also can be such a block to connecting. Like, I think it's so important to talk about it and to weather making mistakes in talking about it. That's something that I feel like I've experienced both sides of, where as a trans person, if I'm talking to somebody who's not trans or who's not queer, they might really want to signal to me that they're a safe person to talk to about that subject, but they're also really afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so then they might not even really bring it up, or they might dance around it, rather than just trying to relate to me on it, like the wrong term or something. If I can tell that they're kind of coming from the right place, or that they're trying to understand, that can be a really worthwhile interaction. And saying the wrong thing isn't a bad thing. It's revealing, and it gives us an opportunity for learning. And then it's the flip side of that, right? Where white people in the US, I think, who kind of at least care about trying to be less racist, really have internalized this idea that we can't ever possibly understand the experience of being a Black person, and that therefore, which is true, but therefore we shouldn't ever talk about race, or talk about experiences of racism. And I think that's where we get it wrong. That I think, like, if we care about this stuff, we have a responsibility to try and understand how it operates, how race as like a systemic force operates, and what white supremacy means and how it works, and to talk about it, and to talk about our understanding of it, and to be wrong sometimes. So I think a lot of times in relationships between people who have different marginalizations, these experiences, they can kind of rhyme with each other or have certain similarities, but they're not the same. But I think it's better to just dive into it and to try to connect, when the other person's interested in doing that, and to risk saying the wrong thing, to risk sounding ignorant, to risk the I really don't actually, it's not, maybe it's not there. Maybe I think it would be there, but it's not. And that's okay. I think it's okay to try to connect. Like, I think that's a big thing about kind of like overcoming shame, that I listen to over and over again, that it's better to kind of be brave, to connect, even if it means it reveals something about you. Like, it reveals that you're ignorant, or it reveals a bias you have that you didn't know that you had. Like, that's how you connect, is by revealing yourself to someone, and to giving them the chance to tell you, you hurt my feelings, or you got that wrong. Like, that's how you build a relationship, not from tiptoeing around ever showing that.
Yeah, I agree. It freezes from time to time. The image, is it freezing for you as well, or is it just at my end?
For me, I hope it records like
Well, if
separately
not,
so that it comes out okay. Yeah.
I'll just have to do some editing anyway. Yeah. That makes me think of what you talk about, the vulnerable connection as being a sort of pathway to shifting shame, as I understand. And it made me think about in Gestalt therapy, we talk about the I-thou relationship, and it comes from Martin Buber. Don't ask me when he was around 150, 200 years ago. But it's this idea that there's a difference between a kind of, subject-object relationship. What can you do for me? How can you help me? And this is the I-thou is the real kind of meeting of the two people in the moment with no particular agenda. Just, as I'm talking to you right now, I'm noticing in my body feels a bit more relaxed after I've just talked about the connection issue. And sort of sharing what's happening in my body, sharing what's happening in my feelings, and sharing my thoughts. And the concept is that in these moments, which aren't very often, there's a real kind of communion or union between the two people. A moment of feeling seen and heard and sort of togetherness. And I thought about that when you talked about vulnerable connection, but I think, it's similar, but I think what you mean more is, as you said, just being able to reveal, being able to speak out your shame, being able to take risks. So I was just wondering if you were able to say a bit more about the vulnerable connection and what that means.
Yeah, I think sometimes part of my approach to stuff and how I talk about it is colored by the fact that I'm not that in my body as a person. That's definitely something I'm still working on. So a lot of times I talk about it more in terms of like the cognitive aspect or like the literal text of what you're talking about versus that feeling of presence and attunement that I think you're describing that is also so important and so valuable. So a lot of times in the book, when I talk about, a lot of it is about sharing things about yourself that you might feel ashamed of, that might be societally stigmatized, and giving someone that opportunity to really see you and accept you, and to share something about themselves maybe too that they feel a little bit uncertain about or ashamed about, and how healing that can be to recognize, okay, this thing that I think sometimes, this like image I get in my head that I feel totally ashamed of, actually a lot of people have that same kind of experience. Or this behavior that I've done that I feel ashamed about. Lots of people do this thing. But that's kind of, it is on the level of kind of text, right? Sharing specific kind of facts and words with people. And I do think the piece that you're talking about is just as important, of actually, am I actually in the moment with the person? And so,
but as you said, that's not always available to people are disconnected from their bodies or less connected for many reasons, right? And I could understand why that would be more tricky for you. I also think that just that the body is the source of emotions and pain, right? So if there's any painful feelings in our bodies, it would make sense that we would have disconnected from our bodies or have a less good relationship. So I guess I want to also say, well, starting to talk and share stuff is a good start, right? And maybe that's what is available to us to begin with. Before moving on stuff, more than embodied connection.
And I think some people, if they're kind of wired like me, like a lot of autistic people are like that, and I think it's a common, people dissociate from their bodies due to a lot of that pain and trauma and things like that, like you described. But I think it is something that is that people can get there, and that is another thing that the therapeutic relationship can be so special for, is kind of slowly practicing tuning back into that stuff.
Okay. I just had one more question, if I may, just slightly not on a different topic, but moving now to what you wrote about I wrote down struggle identity and self-sacrifice, because that's what I talk about in my book. But you talk about this sort of the Protestant work ethic, which I can, all the questions you asked in the book, tick, tick, tick. Yeah, unfortunately, including judging, and embarrassingly to admit, people that I see as, I feel embarrassed to say less productive or lazy even. And also, but also recognizing how that really is problematic for me, that I've sort of introduced these sort of ideas about how to be and the way I can shape myself, to the point where even I can feel guilty if I'm just not doing anything productive or just doing something for fun. I mean, it's not that extreme. I've got a lot better, but it's something I'm actively working on. So I wondered if you had any tips before we end on how to challenge that more, that sort of introduced beliefs about having to struggle and work hard in order to be a worthy person.
Oh gosh, it's something that I've been really fixated on in my work for a long time, because I suffer from it so badly. And like you, I've gotten better at it, but it is still this constant little voice on my shoulder that's like, how are you spending your time? What's the goal here? Like, how are you pursuing your goals and advancing in some way? And I know that was to like keep me safe, right? It was some promise of like, if I am productive enough, I'll be able to provide for myself, and then it won't matter if people think I'm too strange or awkward, or if nobody loves me, because I'll have a job and I'll have money and I'll have status and all these things. So I think it comes a lot of times from shame, these feelings of I need to be hyper productive because that will somehow justify my existence to the world. Or in a very real way, it'll get me the resources that I need to be safe, even if nobody in the world shows up for me. So I think that's often a useful place to kind of interrogate where it comes from for someone. I think working on being more accepting, compassionate towards the people that we find lazy is very helpful. In my book, Laziness Does Not Exist, I tell people just, give money to the unhoused people in your community, talk to them, treat them like a human being, develop relationships with them, develop relationships with people that you've been told are this horrible, shameful thing, and kind of see where they're coming from. I think for a lot of people, it is kind of sitting with the reality of disability and losing ability over time. Even just something like making sure that you have elders in your life and that you're close with them in some way, because then you'll see the fact that the body breaks down and that people's protective capacity breaks down, and that you can still have a worthwhile and connected life. For me, I almost have to trick myself into being busy with things that aren't productivity, so that I'm not obsessing about productivity all the time. So I've been doing a lot of like long bike rides, taking singing lessons, making plans with friends. Like I'm in a little anime watching club with a friend, so I go see these animes every month. Like I have to schedule my downtime the same way that I have to like hyper schedule being productive, because then it forces me to relax a little bit. And figuring out what actually does make you feel good in your body. Which sometimes it isn't relaxation. Sometimes it is like, oh, I'm going to work on this hobby that I have that's like really mentally stimulating, but it's not productive in the conventional sense. And sometimes that's better, because I find that if I try to just like lay back and like relax on the beach or something, I'm too antsy. I'm like, I need to be doing something. But that something could be playing a video game or like doing a puzzle or something. And that's still good. That's still restorative. So those are some of the things that are working for me lately, but oh my gosh, it's a constant struggle to like accept. Like I had a pretty bad burnout the last couple of years, and I might just never get back to that level that I used to be at. And I'm still at war with myself about that fact, So it's still, I think it's a really hard thing for us to unlearn.
Protestant work ethic, hey?
It's terrible.
And it reminds me of what you said about joy and pleasure, and I really like that too. As a kind of counterforce to that, and going on the bike ride, doing things that as you said, you feel good in your body, where there's joy and pleasure, and and just how important that is, and how that's also something I'm working on. So I like you talking about it, because again, the inner critic could be like joy, pleasure. I mean, there's more important things than joy and pleasure, but I put that one side. Yeah.
Yeah. And connection too. It's a lot easier for me sometimes if it's social, if there's a meaningful relationship that I'm nurturing through doing something, then I can say, okay, no, this is actually what's the most important thing in life is these relationships. So
good reminder. Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm going to bring it to close, and thank you very, very much for your time. And I really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you. Thank you for your manner. I felt at ease and I feel a lot more relaxed now than when I started. So that's good.
Yeah. This was a really lovely conversation.
Yeah.